Man abandons helpless German Shepherd puppy in the wild. What happens next is unbelievable. The wind roared through the forest, carrying icy snowflakes that stung like tiny needles. The night was dark and bitterly cold, with no warmth, no shelter. Only endless white stretching in every direction. In the middle of it all, a small German Shepherd puppy stood shivering, his tiny paws sinking into the thick snow. Bruno didn't understand what was happening. Just moments ago, he had been curled up in the truck beside his owner, safe and warm. But now he was outside, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air, his heart pounding with confusion and fear. Up ahead, footsteps crunched against the snow. Bruno's ears perked up as he watched Edward walk away without a single glance back. His tail wagged uncertainly, and he let out a small whimper before taking a few steps forward. Maybe Edward had forgotten something. Maybe he would turn around, scoop Bruno up in his arms and take him home. But Edward didn't stop. He didn't look back. Instead, he climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut. The engine growled to life, its deep rumble cutting through the silence, and the headlights flared, blinding in the darkness. Panic surged through Bruno as the truck began to move. He barked and ran after it, his tiny legs struggling through the thick snow. His heart pounded as he pushed himself harder, slipping and stumbling, but no matter how fast he ran, the truck kept going. The red taillights grew smaller and smaller, flickering like dying embers in the storm, until they disappeared completely. Bruno stopped, his breath ragged, his small body trembling violently. He stood there, listening, hoping to hear Edward's voice calling him back. But there was nothing. Only the wind, only the cold, only the dark. The truth hit him like a crashing wave. Edward was gone. Bruno let out a soft, broken whimper, his ears flattening against his head as he curled up in the snow. The storm howled around him, its icy grip seeping into his bones, a cruel reminder of just how alone he was. The night stretched on, endless and merciless, and for the first time in his young life, Bruno felt something he had never known before. Abandonment. Bruno lay curled in the snow, his small body trembling from both the cold and the fear gripping his heart. The world around him had turned into an unforgiving blur of white, the snowstorm growing fiercer with each passing moment. His tiny whimpers were swallowed by the howling wind, and his once bright eyes were dull with exhaustion. He didn't know how long he had been lying there, but his strength was fading. The warmth inside him was slipping away, and for the first time, he felt the cruel touch of hopelessness. Then, through the blinding storm, a shadow emerged. At first, it was just a shape moving silently through the snow, its steps light and effortless. Bruno barely had the strength to lift his head, but something inside him stirred, a deep, primal instinct. His ears twitched as the figure drew closer, revealing piercing golden eyes that glowed against the darkness. A wolf. She was old but strong, her thick silver gray fur dusted with snow. She moved with the quiet confidence of a leader, her sharp eyes scanning the small, helpless creature before her. The pack remained just beyond the trees, watching cautiously, waiting for her command. Wolves did not welcome outsiders easily, and a domesticated dog had no place among them. But there was something in the way Bruno lay there, so small, so vulnerable, that made the old she-wolf hesitate. She stepped forward, sniffing the trembling pup. Bruno flinched but was too weak to run. He didn't know if she was here to help or to finish what the cold had started. But then, instead of baring her teeth or turning away, the wolf lowered her head and nudged him gently with her nose. Warm breath washed over his frozen fur, and for the first time since he had been left behind, he felt something other than fear. The old she-wolf turned and walked a few steps away before stopping to look back. It was an unspoken invitation. Bruno hesitated, his small body weak and unsteady, but he forced himself to stand. His paws felt numb as he stumbled forward, following her tracks in the deep snow. Step by step, he moved closer until finally, the pack surrounded him. Their watchful eyes bore into him, wary and uncertain. Yet, the she-wolf had already made her decision. With a low, rumbling growl, she signaled the pack to move. Bruno followed, his tiny frame nearly disappearing between the massive wolves. The cold still clung to his fur, but something was different now. He was no longer alone. The days that followed were nothing short of a battle for survival. Bruno, once a pampered puppy who had known only the comfort of a warm home and a soft bed, was now living in a world where weakness meant death. The forest was both beautiful and cruel, filled with towering trees that whispered secrets to the wind and hidden dangers lurking in the shadows. The old she-wolf had saved him, but that didn't mean the pack welcomed him. He was an outsider, different from them in every way. His scent was unfamiliar, his instincts dull compared to their sharp awareness, and worst of all, he did not know how to hunt. The first few days were the hardest. Bruno struggled to keep up with the pack as they moved through the snowy terrain with effortless grace. His legs were shorter, his body not built for the relentless journey through the thick forests and icy rivers. He would slip, stumble, and fall behind, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the cold air burned his lungs. Many times, the younger wolves would snarl at him in frustration, baring their teeth as if to remind him that he did not belong. He was slow, clumsy, and weak, everything a wolf could not afford to be. Yet, despite their hostility, the old she-wolf never turned her back on him. She watched over him with a quiet understanding, as if she saw something in him that the others did not. When Bruno fell behind, she would wait. When he shivered from the cold, she would lay close enough for him to feel her warmth, though she never coddled him. There was no place for softness in the wild, only survival. And so Bruno had to learn. At first, he tried to hunt like the others, mimicking the way they stalked through the underbrush, their bodies low and silent. But he lacked their speed, their precision. He would chase after prey only to trip over his own paws, or misjudge the direction of the wind and alert his target before he even got close. The first time he attempted to take down a rabbit, he pounced too early, missing by inches. The wolves who had been watching scoffed in annoyance, their eyes filled with contempt. A wolf who could not hunt was a burden, and a burden had no place in the pack. Bruno quickly realized that he would never be like them. He wasn't built for the wild in the way they were. But he wasn't completely useless. What he lacked in skill he made up for with something else, instinct. Unlike the wolves, he could sense things in ways they couldn't. He could hear the faintest rustle of leaves long before they did, smell danger before it approached. When a group of hunters moved through the forest one evening, setting traps meant for the wolves, Bruno was the first to detect the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder in the air. He barked in warning, startling the pack just in time for them to avoid an ambush. That was the first time they looked at him differently, not as an outsider but as something more. As the days turned to weeks, Bruno learned the unspoken rules of the forest. He learned how to move with the wind instead of against it, how to read the body language of the pack, and most importantly, how to survive. He was not a wolf, and he never would be. But he was no longer just a house dog either. He had become something in between, something stronger, wiser. The old she-wolf watched his transformation with quiet approval. He still did not fit in entirely, but he had earned his place. And in the brutal, unforgiving wild, that was enough. The forest had become Bruno's home, the wild his teacher. He no longer feared the dark, no longer flinched at the howl of the wind. He moved with quiet confidence now, his senses sharpened, his instincts honed. Though he still could not hunt like the wolves, he had learned their ways, how to listen to the whispers of the trees, how to sense a predator long before it revealed itself. He was one of them in spirit, if not in blood. The pack no longer viewed him as an outsider. He had proven his worth, and that was all that mattered. But the past has a way of finding those who try to leave it behind. It started with a scent, one that Bruno had not smelled in what felt like a lifetime. At first, it was faint, carried by the wind from a distance, barely noticeable. But when it came again, stronger this time, his body froze. A rush of memories flooded his mind, warm hands scratching behind his ears, a soft bed by the fireplace, the sound of laughter. Then the pain, the betrayal, the feeling of being left behind in the freezing snow, his body too weak to move as the storm swallowed him whole. Edward. Bruno's ears flattened. his fur bristling as he peered through the trees. He followed the scent with careful steps, his heart pounding against his ribs. He moved quietly, the way the wolves had taught him, his body low to the ground as he approached the clearing. And then he saw them. Edward stood at the edge of the woods, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression hard with determination. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Henry Carter, Lena's father. Bruno's heart twisted at the sight of him. He had not seen Lena since the day he was abandoned. The thought of her had been a distant ache, something buried deep beneath the survival instincts that had kept him alive. But now, standing so close to a piece of his old life, the emotions he had long suppressed surged forward. Edward's voice cut through the silence, sharp and filled with anger. "I know he's here," he growled, his eyes scanning the tree-line. "That mutt should have been dead by now. And if he's still alive, then he's one of them." Bruno didn't need to guess what he meant. Edward had returned not for him, but for the pack. He wanted revenge. Perhaps he had seen the tracks, heard rumors of a dog living among the wolves. Maybe he simply could not accept that the creature he had abandoned had not only survived but thrived. Henry Carter, however, looked uncertain. His grip on his rifle was hesitant, his gaze flickering toward the trees with something that looked like doubt. "Edward, this is madness," he muttered. "They're just animals. They're not hunting us. We don't need to go after them." But Edward was unmoved. "That thing is no dog anymore," he spat. "It's wild, dangerous, and if we don't put them down now, they'll become a bigger problem later." Bruno's muscles tensed as he watched the scene unfold. The wolves had given him a second chance at life, but now they were in danger because of him. He had spent so long trying to forget his past, but now it was standing right in front of him, armed and ready to destroy everything he had come to love. A rustling in the bushes behind him signaled the presence of the pack. They had sensed the threat, their golden eyes peering through the shadows. The old she-wolf stood among them, silent and watchful. She didn't need to speak. Bruno understood what was about to happen. The wolves would not run. They never ran. As Edward raised his rifle, Bruno felt the wild surge within him. He had spent so long being torn between two worlds, uncertain where he truly belonged. But in this moment, there was no doubt. This was his pack, his family, and he would fight for them. Edward's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes locked onto the shadows of the forest. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only existed in the moments before chaos erupted. Bruno could hear the pounding of his own heart, the rhythmic breathing of the wolves behind him, the faint rustle of leaves as the wind carried the scent of danger. Then movement. The old she-wolf stepped forward, her piercing amber eyes glowing in the dim light. Her presence alone was a warning, a silent command that no intruder was welcome here. But Edward was not a man who listened to warnings. A sharp crack split the air as Edward fired. The bullet whizzed through the trees, striking a nearby branch. The wolves flinched, but they did not run. They never ran. Instead, they moved as one, their bodies shifting in perfect unison. The pack understood the language of battle better than any man ever could. Bruno surged forward before the others could react, his powerful legs carrying him straight into the clearing. He was no longer just a lost dog abandoned in the snow. He was a creature of the wild now, strong, fast, fearless. He lunged at Edward, his teeth bared in a warning snarl. Edward staggered back, startled by the sight of the dog he had once left for dead now standing before him, more alive than ever. "You filthy mutt!" he spat, fumbling to reload his rifle. But Bruno was faster. He snapped his jaws, his fangs inches from Edward's arm, forcing the man to stumble. And then the wolves struck. Like a shadowy storm, they moved in perfect harmony. The young hunters darted forward first, their swift movements forcing Edward and his men to retreat. The old she-wolf led the charge, her deep growl rumbling through the air like distant thunder. Edward fired again, but the wolves were too fast. A young gray wolf darted past him, knocking the gun from his hands. Henry Carter, who had been watching in stunned silence, suddenly turned his weapon toward Edward. "Enough!" he shouted. His voice rang through the trees, commanding and full of authority. Edward turned to him, rage burning in his eyes. "What are you doing?" he yelled. "These beasts need to be put down." Henry shook his head. "You're the only beast here." Realizing he was outnumbered, Edward's fury turned to panic. He staggered backward, his hands trembling. The wolves did not advance any further. They had no desire to kill. But they did not need to. The message had been sent. Edward scrambled to his feet and ran, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. His men hesitated only for a moment before following him, disappearing into the forest like frightened prey. Silence fell over the clearing. The wolves stood still, their golden eyes watching, waiting. Bruno exhaled, his body still tense from the fight. He turned his gaze to the she-wolf, who met his eyes with quiet understanding. They had won. The forest had chosen its justice. But the battle was not truly over. As the last echoes of Edward's retreat faded into the distance, another sound filled the air. A voice, soft and trembling. "Bruno!" His ears twitched. The voice was familiar, pulling him back to a place he had long tried to forget. Slowly he turned. Lena stood just beyond the trees, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto him. She had seen it all, the fight, the wolves, the dog she had once loved standing among them. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her voice barely a whisper. "Come home." And in that moment, Bruno faced the hardest choice of his life. Bruno stood at the edge of the forest, his breath coming in slow, uneven bursts. The cold wind carried Lena's voice to him again, soft yet desperate. "Bruno, come home." Her voice trembled with emotion, thick with years of longing, of waiting. It was the voice he had once known so well, the voice that had comforted him when he was just a pup, the voice that had once been his whole world. His paws, hardened by months of walking on rough terrain, dug slightly into the earth as he hesitated. The ground beneath him was familiar, damp, rich with the scent of pine and the lingering musk of his pack. This forest had been his refuge, his savior. The wild had embraced him when the world had cast him aside. He had learned its language, its rules. He had grown strong here. But now, standing between the trees and the girl he had once belonged to, he felt himself being torn in two. Behind him, the old she-wolf stood silently. She did not nudge him forward, nor did she call him back. Her golden eyes, wise and steady, held no anger, no disappointment, only understanding. She had always known this day would come. Perhaps, from the moment she had taken him in, she had known he was never truly meant to stay. He was not like them. He could never hunt as they did, never run through the trees without a trace. But he had adapted, survived. And now he had a choice to make. Bruno's ears flicked back as memories flooded his mind. The first time he had woken up in the wolves' den, trembling and weak, unsure if they would harm him or let him live. The hunger, the cold, the harsh lessons of survival. The first time he had seen the she-wolf hunt. The way she had let him take scraps when he was too weak to fend for himself. She had never treated him as an outsider, nor as a burden. She had simply accepted him, as if she had known he was meant to be part of her story. But there had always been something missing. The warmth of human hands, the laughter of a girl who had once whispered his name with love, the sound of her footsteps on wooden floors, the scent of home, of safety. Even when he had run through the forest, wild and free, a part of him had still remembered the feeling of curling up beside Lena on cold nights, her arms wrapped around him as she whispered stories. Now she was standing just feet away, her arms stretched out, her eyes pleading. Tears ran down her cheeks, her breath visible in the cold air. "Bruno, please. I never stopped looking for you." Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I thought I lost you forever." Bruno shifted on his paws, torn. The pack behind him was silent, waiting. The wild had no words for goodbyes, no ceremonies for parting ways. But he knew this was a farewell. If he left now, he could never truly return. He would never be one of them again. Slowly, he turned back to the she-wolf. Her eyes met his, calm and knowing. She let out a quiet breath, her tail swishing once against the ground. Then, in a silent gesture of acceptance, she dipped her head. It was enough. Bruno inhaled deeply, then took a step forward. Then another. His paws felt heavier with each step, his heart pounding harder as he left the safety of the trees. The world outside the forest seemed so foreign, so distant. And then, as he reached Lena, she dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "You're home," she whispered. Her voice shook, filled with relief, with love, with something Bruno had not felt in so long. "You're home." For the first time in what felt like forever, Bruno exhaled fully. The wild had changed him. It had shaped him into something stronger, something wiser. It would always be a part of him, whispering in the wind, calling in the distance. And yet, as Lena's arms tightened around him, as the scent of home filled his lungs, he knew he had made his choice. The howls of the wolves echoed in the distance, their voices carrying across the trees. The she-wolf did not follow. She only watched as he disappeared into the world he had once lost. The wild would always call to him, but this time he would not answer. Tonight, Bruno walked toward something greater than survival. He walked toward home. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the land as Bruno lay on the wooden porch of the Carter farmhouse. The warmth of the setting sun felt different from the cold touch of the forest, but he had grown to welcome it. It had been weeks since he had returned, yet the call of the wild still lingered within him like a distant echo, a song only he could hear. He was no longer just a house dog, nor was he fully a creature of the wild. He had become something in between, a bridge between two worlds. Lena never left his side. She watched over him as if afraid that, one day, he might vanish back into the trees. At night, when she thought he was asleep, she would reach out and rest her hand on his fur, as if to reassure herself that he was still there. And each time, Bruno would press closer, silently telling her that he wasn't going anywhere. But the forest had not forgotten him. One morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the mist, a familiar sound carried through the crisp air. A long, deep howl, not of just any wolf but of her, the old she-wolf. Bruno's ears perked up, his body tensing as he stood. The sound pulled at something deep within him, stirring memories of nights spent under the open sky, of lessons learned in the unforgiving wild. He stepped forward, drawn toward the sound, his heart caught between two lives. At the edge of the forest, the she-wolf stood in the shadows of the trees. Her golden eyes met his, filled with something unspoken. She had come to see him one last time. Not to take him back, not to call him away, but to say goodbye. Bruno stood frozen, his paws just inches from the forest floor. He wanted to run to her, to bury his nose in her fur, to let her know that he had never forgotten what she had done for him. But he knew he couldn't go back. This was his home now. The she-wolf did not move closer. She simply watched him, as if memorizing every detail, as if she, too, was caught between holding on and letting go. Then, slowly, she let out one final breath, dipped her head in silent understanding, and turned away. Bruno didn't follow. He stood there, watching as she disappeared into the trees, her silhouette fading into the mist until she was nothing more than a memory, a whisper in the wind. A soft hand brushed against his fur. Lena had come to stand beside him, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. She didn't speak, didn't ask him to turn away. She simply stood there, offering her presence, her warmth. Bruno exhaled, his body relaxing. The wild would always be a part of him. The lessons it had taught him, the strength it had given him, those things would never leave. But he had made his choice. With one last glance at the forest, he turned back to Lena, walking beside her toward the house. The howl of the she-wolf faded into the wind, carrying with it the farewell that neither of them had needed to speak. Bruno was no longer lost. He had found his way home, and as he lay by Lena's side that night, listening to the distant sounds of the wild, he knew that even though a part of him would always belong to the forest, his heart had finally found where it truly belonged. Life on the Carter farm slowly settled into a new rhythm, but Bruno was not the same dog who had once played in Lena's arms as a carefree puppy. The wilderness had changed him, sculpted him into something different, something stronger, wiser, and quieter. He no longer barked at the rustling of leaves, nor did he flinch at the crack of thunder. The dog that had once belonged solely to a warm home now carried the spirit of the untamed forest within him. Lena noticed the differences, though she never questioned them. She saw it in the way he moved, graceful, measured, aware of every sound and scent around him. She saw it in his eyes, a depth that had not been there before. He was no longer just her dog. He was something more. Yet, no matter how much the wild had shaped him, he never strayed far from her side. Henry Carter, Lena's father, watched Bruno with quiet approval. He wasn't one for many words, but he showed his acceptance in his own way. One afternoon, he built a new doghouse near the barn. A sturdy shelter, warm and inviting. But Bruno never used it. Every night, when the house grew silent and the world outside darkened, he would curl up beside Lena's bed, just as he had when he was a pup. Still, the wild was never far. On certain nights, when the wind carried the scent of the forest, Bruno would step outside and sit on the porch. His ears perked, his eyes scanning the distant tree line. Sometimes, if he listened carefully, he could hear faint howls in the distance, his past calling out to him. He never howled back, but he never ignored it either. He simply sat there, feeling the pull of both worlds, knowing he belonged to both. One morning, as Lena fed the horses, she noticed Bruno standing at the edge of the property, gazing into the trees. Her heart clenched, fearing that maybe, one day he would leave again. "You're not thinking of going back, are you?" she asked softly, walking up to him. Bruno turned to her, his amber eyes filled with something she couldn't quite read. Then, as if answering her unspoken fears, he nuzzled his head against her side. A breath of relief escaped her lips. She knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick fur. "I love you, Bruno," she whispered. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Bruno looked back at the forest. He would never forget what it had given him, the lessons, the strength, the second chance at life. But as Lena held him close, he knew the truth. The wild had saved him, but love had brought him home, and he was home to stay. Days passed, then weeks, and Bruno fully settled into his life on the Carter farm. The warmth of Lena's love and the quiet acceptance of Henry Carter gave him a sense of belonging. Yet, no matter how much he adjusted, the wild never truly let go of him. It lingered in the way he moved, in the way he watched the horizon, always aware, always listening. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Bruno lay on the porch, his head resting on his paws. The farm was quiet, bathed in the golden glow of dusk. Lena sat beside him, absently running her fingers through his thick fur. The world felt peaceful, safe. And then the sound came. A single, low, haunting howl drifted through the air, rising and falling like a song only the wild could understand. Bruno's ears perked, his body tensing as his breath hitched. He knew that voice, the old she-wolf. He lifted his head, his amber eyes locking onto the distant tree line. In the fading light, a lone figure stood just beyond the edge of the forest. She didn't step forward, didn't call him again. She simply stood there, watching. Lena followed his gaze and felt her stomach twist. "Bruno?" she whispered, her fingers tightening against his fur. For a long moment he didn't move. The pull of the wild was there, deep and familiar. He could still remember the way the snow felt beneath his paws, the way the wind whispered secrets only the forest could understand. A part of him longed to run back into the darkness, to answer the call of the only other family he had ever known. The she-wolf tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for his decision. Bruno stood up, his muscles coiled with tension. His heart pounded. This was it, the final choice. Then, Lena reached out and placed her hand against his chest. Her touch was soft, warm, grounding. Bruno let out a slow breath. He turned back to her, meeting her eyes before glancing once more at the forest. The she-wolf remained still, silent. understanding. A soft breeze ruffled his fur, carrying with it the scent of pine, of damp earth, of a life he had once lived. And then, as if knowing the answer before he did, the she-wolf slowly turned away. She stepped back into the trees, her form fading into the shadows until she was gone. Bruno watched for a moment longer, then exhaled. The wild had let him go. He lowered himself back onto the porch beside Lena, resting his head against her leg. She let out a breath of relief, her fingers tangling in his fur. "You're home," she whispered. Bruno closed his eyes. Yes, he was home, but deep in the forest, where the trees whispered and the moon cast silver light over the earth, his past would always remain. A part of him would always belong to the wild. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind was just right, he would still hear the echoes of the wolves, reminding him of the journey that had shaped him. Bruno's journey was one of survival, loyalty, and an impossible choice between two worlds. Though he found his way back home, he would never forget the lessons of the wild or the ones who saved him when he was most vulnerable. His story is a reminder that love comes in many forms, sometimes in the warmth of a familiar touch, and sometimes in the silent understanding of a goodbye. What do you think? If you were in Bruno's place, would you have chosen to stay with the pack or return home? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible animal stories.